And it's Michelle Wilson with the National Fund for Workforce Solutions, coming to you with our final webinar in our Advancing Workforce Equity data webinar series. And we have a really treat for you today because you guys went through the data part, and we talked about how we do factor analysis and how we drill down into that. But I'm sure you're all wondering, like, so what does that look like in action? And so we're going to spend some time on that today. So welcome. So next slide, JL. JL wants to take the club. Coming out of the jazz club. Yeah, thanks, JL. So mute and unmute is on the bottom left-hand corner. You guys know that by now. And you can *6 to unmute as well too. Next slide. And then if you need to pair, there's a join audio, and there's a code #51# on your phone if you need to do a participant ID. Next slide. As I stated to you earlier, I am Michelle Wilson. I'm the Director of Evaluation and Continuous Learning with the National Fund for Workforce Solution. I also was a project director on the Advancing Workforce Equity Initiative that we just completed in January or February. And we have with us today our special guest, Andrea Glispie, who is the Senior Director of Career Pathways for United Way of Metropolitan Dallas, and was the lead for the Dallas collaborative that was working on the Advancing Workforce Equity Initiative. So you'll hear from her today. Next. So our agenda, obviously, welcome and introductions, deep dive into Dallas's approach to the Advancing Workforce Equity work using data. Some time for Q&A with Andy, and then we're going to spend just a little bit of time just going over giving you a preview of the toolkit that we developed as a result of our work. So just to show you kind of what that looks like. It's in beta testing, but when you can expect to have access to it and what all is in there. And so then we'll close and wrap up. And that is what we'll do with our time today. So, and those are our objectives as well too. So moving on. So without further delay, I just want to go ahead and turn this over to Andy. Andy, welcome, and thank you for sharing with us today. It's all yours.
Thank you, Michelle. It's great to be with you and with everyone on the Zoom call. This afternoon, it's gray, but warming up here in Dallas. So I hope that spring is either coming for you or soon to follow in your neck of the woods. In the next 15 or 20 minutes or so, I want to share a little bit about Dallas's equity journey. As Michelle mentioned, we were one of 5 cities that released local workforce equity reports with the great support of National Fund for Workforce Solutions and PolicyLink with funding provided by JPMorgan Chase. And that report really helped us to understand in a deeper way what equity gaps were in our workforce in terms of disparities in pay and employment, particularly facing workers of color, and also what our vision was for workforce equity and what were the concrete steps we needed to take to realize that vision. So I just wanted to share that work with you all today in the hopes that it helps you all along your own equity journey. So if you go to the next slide. Before I launch into our equity strategies that are included in our Dallas equity report, I first wanted to kind of give you a sense of what our process was from the first moment when we were given the great invitation to work with National Fund and PolicyLink on this project to the moment where the report was released formally back in January. You know, our equity journey, believe it or not, started 18 months ago in a hot summer day in July 2019, where we gathered some key members from the local, from our local workforce and education system together to talk about getting their involvement in the project. And that really is what I would call our setting the the table phase. That small meeting at first consisted of someone from Dallas College, a few folks from philanthropy, someone representing our public workforce system, a couple of community-based training providers. And, we spent some time really talking about, what it is we wanted to get from, doing this report. And ultimately, who else we needed to bring to the table, and what our vision for equity, workforce equity would be. So setting the table really started with solidifying our workforce, our working group, which I'll share some of the members in a second. But we grew that group and included, more people from the business community, philanthropy, our public sector, like our city government, and then also just a lot of community-based organizations that have close connections with communities of color. From there, we really spent a lot of time discussing what our definition for workforce equity was. We spent a brainstorm meeting just deciding, what facets of the definition needed to be included, and then even had subsequent emails and surveys to really nail it down in stone. So our vision for workforce equity is included in our report, but it basically boils down to, working towards a labor market where there aren't disparities in pay or income, where anyone, regardless of their demographic characteristic, can access a living wage job with benefits and career advancement opportunities, and that we center communities of color as we are working towards this vision. So that was really became our North Star. And at any subsequent meeting we had of the advice of the working group, we always had someone from the group actually read the workforce equity definition word for word, so people were grounded in it and understood what we were working towards. The next thing we had to do in that first phase of work is decide on the geographic area that we wanted to pull. And we had the option of just focusing on Dallas City, Dallas County, which included the city and some of the surrounding suburbs, or the whole Dallas-Fort Worth metropolitan area, Fort Worth being a sister city of sorts to Dallas. We ultimately landed on focusing on Dallas County and Collin County, a county just north of Dallas, which has been just ripe with some very robust economic development over the years, having several multinational companies moving their headquarters to that area. So we picked those two areas because Dallas is the most populous, and then Collin County has the highest degree of economic development going on. The next step is what I really call exploring systems. We realized that when we thought about what it would take to achieve workforce equity, it wasn't going to just boil down to the workforce system. We needed to have a wider lens. Because we think about what it takes for someone to get prepared to enter the workforce system, enter the labor market, or advance in the labor market once they get there. There's a whole range of systems and supports that they need, like affordable housing that's near opportunity jobs, efficient transportation so they don't spend undue hours and unpaid commute time, accessible and quality childcare so they can work and be assured that their children are well taken care of. So we really decided that as a group and for the sake of the report, we wanted to look at this larger, what we call economic opportunity system. We also, even before looking at the data as a group, as it came in from PolicyLink and their data partners at Burning Glass Technologies, we talked as a group as what we expected to see from the data and what were some of the drivers of workforce inequities that we thought we would see from the data. And so those were things like inadequate workforce supports, for instance, So we isolated some of those things so that when we looked at the data, we would be able to make connections between what was driving the data and what the data was telling us. I would say for the most of 2020 was really about gathering the data and analyzing it and starting to come to some consensus of what our key findings were. The report includes aspects of quantitative as well as qualitative data. We convened local focus groups of employers and training providers, really just to, and workers, not training providers, so that we could have an understanding of, what were their perceptions of the labor market and some of the opportunities and challenges therein. And from there, we, reviewed not only the quantitative data, but also kind of connected it with what was said in these focus groups, as well as ultimately with the drivers of inequity that we came to. A big part of our work during the second half of last year from about, well, actually more than that, probably from about April through December of last year, was developing our set of equity strategies, basically our recommendations for bringing about greater workforce equity. And that really was is because we didn't want this to be a report that was just about the data and how bad things are, but really provided a vision and maybe even a rallying cry to bring the community together and working towards workforce equity. So to do that, we kind of took a series of steps to come to our final set of 8 recommendations, which I'll share with you in a second. The first thing we did, and Michelle alluded to it in her opening comments, is that we conducted a factor analysis. So we basically looked at key data points that would be in the final report. And we asked ourselves a series of questions as a group as, what was driving the data that we were seeing and what could address the data. So that we could really get down to root causes and conditions. And then from there, begin to think about, what solutions could we put in place to deal with those root causes. After we did the factor analysis, we used a design thinking technique called How Might We, where we took basically what we said as the root causes in our factor analysis and turned it into an open-ended brainstorming question, a series of open-ended brainstorming questions. For instance, if somebody said, if one of our root causes driving a particular data point was the lack of affordable childcare, how might we question maybe, how do we, how might we design a childcare system where workers at every level in the labor market have access to it and can depend on it? And then after we formulated that, how might we question, then as a group, we attempted to answer that question with just, anything and everything, nothing was off the table. And, from those series of how might we questions, we came up with, I would say at one point, at least 40 different equity strategies that, could, be part of the final report. We knew that we couldn't have that many. We really wanted our goal to be to get down to at least 8 to 10 strategies. And so to do that, we used a feasibility analysis. And some of you may have seen it. It's like a square with 4 quadrants that basically allows you to look at, what impact would moving a particular strategy would be and how much time it would take. And so, for each strategy, we kind of plotted it in one of the 4 quadrants of this feasibility matrix to really understand, okay, if we did this, what kind of impact would we have and how much time would it and resources would it take to do it? So some strategies fell off the list because we didn't feel like the impact was very great given the resources that would need to be put into it, or it just seemed very unrealistic for us to take on, as a community. And through that feasibility exercise, we landed on the 8 strategies, which I will share with you in a second. So if we can go on to the next slide. Before I do that, I mentioned our working group, and here is just kind of the organizations that made up of our working group. And you can see that it's a wide range of groups representing business, the public sector, the workforce system, community colleges, philanthropy, and community-based organizations. One organization that we pulled into the mix that isn't a traditional education or workforce organization is Dallas Truth Racial Healing and Transformation. This is an organization that is focused on just what it says, changing the narrative about Dallas's racial history and facilitating understanding and shared healing over our troubled past. And we really felt it was important to have their involvement because when we think about workforce equity, it really does connect back to narrative change and how we think about workers in the system, and how they got where they were, and that really allows us to identify root causes that are driving inequities in our workforce system, and then allows us to build a new narrative of how we can change that. And so just all their work on narrative change as it relates to Dallas's racial history, we realized that expertise and thinking was going to be helpful in our own work. So if you go to the next slide. So I just wanted to first share our 8 equity strategies that ended up in our Advancing Workforce Equity report, and then I'll go into each of them a little bit more specifically. So our first strategy really focused on increasing the number of good jobs available to workers of color, because the data found that we just right now don't have enough good jobs to go around. And the good jobs that we have are disproportionately going to white workers. The second strategy is around increasing the number of workers of color in apprenticeships or pre-apprenticeship programs. So there's pipelines to industries where workers of color are underrepresented. And what we found from our data is that we have a deeply segregated workforce, where white workers are clustered in higher paying administrative or managerial jobs, and workers of color, specifically Latinx and Black workers, are crowded in low paying jobs. So we thought that apprenticeships not only would give people the needed skills, but also the social networks to be able to get into industries that not many workers like them are in. Number 3 focuses on using skills-based hiring, retention, and advancement strategies to, again, reduce occupational segregation that we see in the labor market. That's really tied to employer practices in the ways that employers hire and promote their workforce. Number 4 and then 5 recommendation on the next slide focuses on investments that we're making in our workforce support programs. With number 4 focused on increasing investments in adult literacy, integrated learning programs that combine basic education, industry-specific information, and adult literacy programs. And the number 5 recommendation, which focuses on increasing investments in wraparound supports, like accessible childcare, affordable housing, and transportation. One of the really kind of, I think, neat things about our report, which we really, not that I have seen has really been elevated in our local kind of discourse, is this idea of the social determinants of work. And that's kind of like, if you are familiar with the social determinants of health, those are the factors that contribute to someone's well-being, like where they live, how high their education level is, how much money they make. Well, the social determinants of work kind of take that thinking and apply it to what it takes for someone to enter and advance and be successful in the labor market. Things like affordable housing, efficient transportation, affordable childcare. And so what we've seen is that from the data, when we looked at childcare, transportation, and housing, was that particularly Black and Latinx families are spending a disproportionate amount of their income on these supports, such that, you know, they're having to make really hard decisions about whether it makes sense to work in the first place or take a promotion if they lose some of their subsidies and things of that nature. The last three recommendations really focus on what I would say the system, with number 6, the recommendation number 6, really spotlighting the need to disaggregate participant outcomes from education and workforce programs by race and ethnicity, so that we can really see who's enrolling in our local programs, how are they faring, are they graduating, are they getting jobs in the industries that they trained for, and are they retaining those jobs? We really don't have a good sense, based on the data that is available, of how workers of color are faring. And that data is really essential to taking stock first and foremost, but developing interventions that can promote success for workers of color in our training programs. The 7th recommendation is really around better aligning workforce development initiatives with worker rights projects, such as in Dallas, we have an organization called the Workers Defense Project, which was really critical in getting the city of Dallas to pass a paid leave benefit for workers. It's since gotten tied up in courts, but it was an important win nonetheless. And we just saw that there is a great opportunity to connect these organizations that are focused on improving workforce protections in the workforce with workforce development, so that workers that are enrolled in training can have better understanding of what their rights are in the workplace and advocate for themselves. And then the final recommendation really speaks to just the affordability housing challenges that we have in Dallas. With, you know, our data found that Black renters and Latinx renters are spending at least half of their income on housing. And so, you know, we feel that with the 8th recommendation, if we can improve coordination between workforce development and housing systems, we can not only reduce the housing cost burden on workers, but also ensure that they can access opportunity jobs. If we can go to the next slide. So I want to just spotlight each recommendation and kind of talk to you about basically what we mean by each recommendation in terms of what employers, funders, and community-based organizations can do to support and advance the recommendation. So as it relates to increasing the number of good jobs, we see that employers can pilot job quality strategies for frontline positions and then measure the impact of that work on turnover rates or employee engagement. You know, through my work with our local funding collaborative, Pathways to Work, we were able to dabble in this effort by providing micro grants to local hospitals that were having trouble retaining patient care technicians. And we really saw that with the nominal grants, less than $20,000 a piece, hospitals were able to pilot things like employee recognition programs, better on-the-job training that cut their retention and vacancy rates in half. Funders can play a part in this by, you know, actually paying for these employer-based pilot projects. It's not a traditional space that a lot of funders play in, but it can be with some creative thinking on the part of funders. And then community-based organizations, you know, with their tight connections with the local community, they can position themselves as a partner with local human resource departments at businesses where, you know, they can offer community resources to frontline staff that, you know, even though they're working, they're dealing with things like rent, you know, making rent, having enough food on the table, cobbling together good childcare, or even things like domestic violence. If we're going to go to the next slide. In terms of increasing the number of workers of color in apprenticeship programs, you know, for employers, they can plug into existing initiatives such that are going on at Dallas College. Dallas College a few years ago received a multi-million-dollar grant from the Department of Labor to kick off a series of healthcare apprenticeships. And there's been other subsequent initiatives that, you know, employers can take advantage of and get involved with. You know, funders really in this space can invest in capacity building, specifically, you know, strategic communications and community organizing strategies that can better connect communities of color with existing apprenticeship opportunities, you know, at places like Dallas College. And then community-based organizations, they have a role to play just in terms of, you know, as they're recruiting people for apprenticeships to screen them and make sure that they're good matches for the apprenticeship opportunities that are available. Next slide. In terms of utilizing skills-based approaches to hiring, retention, and advancement, one big thing that employers can do is just remove credential requirements from job postings and just build job postings around the skills that they need and not necessarily what degrees a job candidate has. You know, funders in this space can really invest in capacity building, specifically of employers that, you know, want to make a change in how they hire or advance people, but not sure how to do it. So funders can invest in capacity building or community learning opportunities for employers. And community-based organizations, you know, with what they're doing as far as providing career coaching, career development, job training, they can make sure that what they're doing with their participants has a skills-based approach to it, so that it's in line, so that really that the participants in their training programs have the ability to talk about what skills and capacities they bring to the table when they are applying for jobs. Next slide. You know, investing in adult literacy really speaks for itself. One thing that employers can do is, especially for their frontline staff, is provide incentives to frontline staff to participate in training. You know, very simple things like building it into the schedule of frontline staff or providing paid time off so workers can go into adult literacy training can go a long way. Again, funders in this area, because Dallas has a lot of great literacy opportunities, can really fund outreach to make sure that communities of color are connected with these opportunities. And community-based organizations can forge stronger connections with community colleges so that there are warm handoffs for individuals that are building their literacy skills and ready for post-secondary education, so that they have a seamless transition from going from learning in a community-based organization to then attending college and being on a college campus. Next slide. Investing in wraparound supports is, again, just, you know, because of the social determinants of work are just so important to helping someone not only enter and advance in the labor market. You know, employers in this space, when they look at the benefits that they give to their workers, they can provide flex spending and dependent care benefits for frontline workers that are typically just reserved for managerial or professional staff. You know, funders, again, can just invest in more wraparound supports or ensure that the supports that they are investing in are integrated with local workforce development programs. And community-based organizations can really help build a case for why these supportive services are so important through both quantitative and qualitative data. Next slide. Disaggregating participant outcomes is another key indicator, and I can't underscore how important it is to disaggregate data. I actually was just listening to a podcast earlier today about tax law and the systemic racism that is just inherent and threaded through our tax code. And people don't know about it because the IRS doesn't report data based on race and ethnicity. So, really through data, disaggregated data, we can bring so many more things to light that we don't see at first glance. So employers, even though, I know there's a lot of hesitancy here, but, they have a role to play of being transparent about who's in their workforce by disclosing EEO1 survey results. Funders can obviously support capacity building around disaggregated data collection, the analysis of this data, and how to use it, either with the public education and workforce system or with community-based organizations. And community-based organizations can train staff on data disaggregation with the support that they get from funders. Next slide. In terms of connecting workforce development initiatives with worker rights projects, employers can really, they have a lot of data, at their fingertips, and they can use that workforce data and data that may have on workforce incidents to really kind of start to connect the dots for themselves between productivity, competitiveness, and worker health and safety. Funders can really support collaborations between organizations in Dallas, like the Worker Defense Project, with workforce development organizations, so that, again, participants in training programs, not only are they building their occupational skills, but also their knowledge about what's appropriate and what's not in the workplace. In community-based organizations, they can use the support that they get from funders to reach out to worker rights organizations and start design teams where they can start to braid the work of training with the work of worker rights advocacy. Next slide. And then the final recommendation, and I'll stop talking, is around, again, strengthening coordination between workforce development and housing systems. So employers in this space, they can do a very simple thing by not simple, but I guess it kind of is simple, but costs money, is that they can provide down payment assistance or matches to help their workforce, be able to purchase a house or a condo. Funders can support new or continued demonstration projects to strengthen the impact of wraparound housing that's also paired with employment and education and workforce supports. And community-based organizations can advocate for closer connections between housing and workforce services. I actually had a very interesting conversation about a month ago with our local Dallas Housing Authority, and they are in talks with Dallas College to potentially give students at the college priority access, priority standing on voucher waiting lists if they're housing insecure. And and I kind of pushed and said, where we have a lot of community-based workforce programs where, places like Perscolis, where people are earning industry recognized credentials that also are housing insecure. And so we're looking into the possibility that workers in those types of programs would also get priority standing on voucher waiting lists. So that's just one tangible example. It's small, but it really brings into focus about, how you can connect workforce development with housing. So those are our recommendations. If you go to the next slide. The real work for us begins because we have 8, broad, powerful recommendations, and we can't work on all 8 of them right away. But now that the report is released, we want to as our working group still meets, even though the report is out. And we're looking at how do we prioritize the recommendations so that we have a sense of what we want to work on first so we can get some quick wins. And so as a working group, we kind of asked ourselves these 3 questions in terms of, for each individual, the working group, what recommendations align with their individual work. The second thing we asked our working group to think about is how their organization as a whole would prioritize each recommendation. And then we went through an exercise where we, as a working group, thought through how should we prioritize the recommendations for action as a larger group. And so, that happened over the course of 2 meetings and in February and just earlier this month. So if you go to the next slide. Next slide, yeah. This is kind of what we ended on. As a group, we wanted to, we decided that we would first start, putting our time and attention and resources into these recommendations. As you can see, the recommendations on skills-based hiring, disaggregating participant outcomes, investing in adult literacy, and aligning workforce development with worker rights projects. It doesn't mean to say that the other 4 recommendations aren't going to get any love. For sure, we're definitely going to look at ways where the other recommendations overlap and sometimes intersect or integrate into these 4 priority recommendations. For instance, if we get people to start disaggregating data and they start asking themselves questions about, why are Black males enrolling but not showing up the first day, it could be an issue of not having the right workforce supports in place. And that brings us back to our recommendation on investing in wraparound supports. So not only are we prioritizing, but we're looking for ways where the recommendations overlap and support one another. So that, I think that is my last slide. So thank you again for listening to me. If you have any questions about our process, my email is right before you. Feel free to reach out. One thing that we are doing as a community, in addition to working on our prioritized recommendations, is also holding a series of listening sessions with community groups or organizations so we can help them dig deeper into the data of the report, but also help them see the connections between historical moments nationally and locally that have led to some of the workforce outcomes that we've seen today. In a hope that, once they have that awakening, they'll be even more inspired to work with us on our equity strategies. So in addition to just actually doing the work, we are focused on that as well. So be happy to share how that shakes out as we conduct the listening sessions. Thanks so much for your time, and I look forward to any questions you have. Oh, you're on mute, Michelle.
Thanks. Thanks, Andy. I was saying that was great. I appreciate you coming and sharing the work. We really enjoyed working with Dallas. I mean, they went in hard from the beginning on this, and so we really appreciate the work that they put into this. So I will open this up for questions that you may have for Andy about any part of the process. Andy, while we're waiting for people to see if they have any questions, you can put them in the chat or you can come off mute. But there was a question last week about engaging stakeholders and how you get the right people at the table. So can you speak to a little about that? Because I remember you guys went back and forth. What I remember is the first meeting, you had some folks that you thought you wanted, but when you went around the room and started talking about the work, there were people that you then identified, oh no, we're missing this group, But just in terms of people coming to the table and being engaged and just speak a little bit about the experience and some of the tension points, because I think the other part that I don't want to get lost here is that what we are talking about is workforce equity. So equity, it's messy work, right? There are no clean cut lines to how you get to equity. If that were true, we would be there. maybe already or not, right? So could you just talk a little bit about some of the tension points, how you bring people to the table, and even your decision-making processes, like how you got to some of those? Yes. You're on mute. Now you're on mute.
That pesky mute button. I definitely have a community organizing background, kind of how I cut my teeth after school many years ago. And one of the things that I learned from organizing that I definitely applied to this work is, really, having a firm understanding of what your vision is. And so I think that, it was so critical for us to, even though at that early moment, our working group was not completely solidified, we still spent a lot of time on that vision, because it was important not only to keep those people engaged that we did have at the table, but then be able to have a way to position ourselves and market ourselves to people that we still needed. So it's almost like we were building the plane and flying at the same time. So we were working on the vision as a smaller group, and then using that same vision to attract the attention of some newer groups that we wanted to bring into the fold. And just as in the process of doing that is, a lot of people, and rightly so, and I think this is great. I think we've reached a moment in our field where I think a lot of stakeholders are thinking about what they're doing through an equity lens, and how they really are engaging communities of color, and what an impact are they having. So whenever I asked the community to other stakeholders to get involved, I shared our vision foremost, but I really tried to understand and position their work in such a way where their vision that working with us ultimately would help them and their own work. And so that's really how I brought additional people at the table. And then to your second question about decision-making, it didn't end up in our process slide, but we did as a group decided how we would make decisions very, very early on in our equity journey. I think probably after we had the vision, we as a group decided, what was our process for basically, making a decision. We decided as a group that, each organization, one voice, one vote. The votes counted if you were in the room or on the call at the time, and majority prevailed. And so we also at almost every meeting of the working group, we always did three things. We read the equity vision. We had a series of ground rules, our group norms, and we reviewed the decision-making guidelines. You're on mute.
Sorry about that. So questions coming into the chat, one from Abby. What would you do differently looking back on the process? Any pitfalls that we should be aware of as we engage in this work?
The heart of our equity strategy development work happened during stay-at-home orders, where everybody was working from home. And so we had to rely on Zoom, which, in some ways, I think was more accessible to people because they didn't have to worry about, time away from the office and in commute, in transit to get to our meeting in person. But we definitely, it's also hard to do creative brainstorming work over Zoom, and people's attention, even though they may be logged on, their attention may be more divided if they're also sending email, looking at their phone or whatnot. So obviously I always think about how this work would have unfolded differently if the pandemic hadn't happened and we had the luxury of being in a room with a bunch of flip chart paper and markers. The other thing that I would say is, we were looking at the data and developing recommendations at the same time. which has its pros and cons. I do wish that we had all the data at once and could really look at it as a whole, and really decide what our key findings were and what the story it is we were telling from the data, and then walk through recommendations. We didn't really have that luxury just because of just the number of people who are involved, and the pandemic, and just the way the project unfolded. But I would say that if you're in a space where you can look at the data as a whole and decide on the story that it's telling you, and then embark on a process of making recommendations, that to me, I think could be a good way to go.
I agree. Like the data piece was probably the biggest chunk. I mean, I think the other thing that I would say, and this was because of the time of the project, is that we didn't really have a lot of space for that iterative process. We kind of went, and this was a pilot in many ways. This is the first time we were doing this, so it's kind of like just going through. But it really is the kind of project that would benefit from having space to be iterative about what you're learning and how you are bringing that into the conversation. Question from Ramona: did faith-based groups play a role, and how challenging is it to get employers on board and sharing data?
Yeah, actually early on, we did have an organizer that worked in the faith-based community that was going to join the advisory group and then join the working group, but then had other things come up and was not able to. So we definitely lost that, that we hope we will be able to engage faith-based groups through our listening sessions we want to do now the report is out. So it was a missed opportunity we hope to rectify now, as we work on implementing our recommendations. And for employers, I think we had a number of employers that were on our working group, specifically from Toyota, PNC Bank, Comerica Bank, TD Industries, which is our construction company, and JP Morgan Chase, which funded the project. But I think what really compelled some of these businesses to get involved is that they had their own diversity, equity, inclusion goals that they were trying to reach as a company. So they saw getting involved in this work as maybe a way that could help them reach their own internal goals. Sharing data, I think that's the next frontier. We have been successful in getting employers to share data on things like turnover and vacancy rates and just who's in their workforce. When we did our job quality work with our local hospitals around patient care technicians. But I think for the sake of workforce equity, that's going to be a new terrain that we're going to embark on. One of the things that I'll be doing, and I'll love to be able to report back, is kind of reconvening a technology industry partnership that will really focus on getting more workers of color in technology jobs, and beginning with getting employers to share data on their current technology workforce. So we'll see how that goes. I mean, we're gonna have to pitch it as a way that ultimately this helps them. But I think that there are probably some anxieties that we're going to have to work through that employers might have when it comes to sharing data.
I also want to say, so you asked the question about faith-based organizations playing a role. Each one of our collaboratives made some very deliberate decisions about who sat at the table, who was in, who was out, right, based on how they were approaching the work. There were some organizations, some collaboratives who chose not to have any political folks on there. There was another organization that wanted that, right, because it was in line with the city's new mayor's initiative or agenda. So, but really having that digging in with that work group around what difference will this role play in the work that we're doing, right? And I think we talked about that and around we asked folks to make sure that the groups were made up of decision makers, influencers, or dot connectors, right, as being really critical to the role. So I would look at it that way in terms of whether or not you brought in a faith-based group, any group that you're considering that they line up in one of those three. One of those three buckets. Let's see, mindful of time. Okay, so here's a question here. What was the strategy for getting workforce and housing silos together?
That is still to be worked out. I mean, I think that one of the ways we are going to try and do this is through getting the priority status for workers enrolled in education and training, whether it's at a community college or a community-based organization who is also on a voucher list. I think that hopefully that will happen and be an early win. But we want to look at things like who's sitting on the workforce board, for instance. Right now, there isn't a housing representative or someone from DHA, Dallas Housing Authority, on the workforce board. So that could be an opportunity if we're able to help facilitate that. Our city of Dallas has a brand new affordable housing plan that it's rolling out. And so we have an opportunity to advocate for closer connections to workforce development as part of that affordable housing plan. So there's some levers that we can push on initially, and we'll just have to hopefully, see where we get with that and what we learn from that moving forward.
And then I think we have there's a question here. So when it comes to the blueprint, are different organizations taking ownership of moving the recommendations forward? And how will you hold yourselves collectively accountable or track your progress?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's really the hope, is that our funding collaborative isn't doing everything. Is that we've got other stakeholders either in our working group or in the larger community that are helping to own this. And I think that's why our release events on the report is out is so important, is not only to educate people about the data, but get them inspired to act. So, that really, through kind of that prioritization process that I shared with you about getting our working group members to think about, what aligns with their individual work, what aligns with their organization, is our hope that, by having those kinds of conversations, we can get people to step up and own something. And I was going to say something else, but it's gone, unfortunately. I think I need more coffee.
Been there, done that. That's called every day in my life. Okay, great. So, so people are saying, thank you. This has been really useful with your sharing, Andy. So I'm going to, in the Q&A here, so we can spend the last few minutes just going over the, giving you a glimpse of the toolkit, the guide, which maps on to what Andy did, and just talk a little bit about the differences. So Jo, can you is that slide up there? We'll put that up there. Okay. So Andy beautifully laid out how her collaborative, how she and the collaborative went through this work. And so we also kind of chronicled what was happening and decided to create a guide in case someone wanted to produce this type of work. And so I love Andy's slides because they map onto what we have done here. I mean, it's the work that we did, but it also speaks to how they customize it for their community, right? And so this guide is designed to be just that, a guide for you and an approach for how you can go through a process such as this, but at every point, knowing that what makes it yours is just being able to make it speak to your community. So as I said, this is in beta testing, and this will be released at the end of May. The three the webinar series will be a part of that as well too. These are just screenshots because it's in beta testing right now with a few folks. So it's on our landing page, and it's a guide for stakeholders, and it tells you what's in the guide and who should use it. Next slide, JL. And then we really literally just go through the phases of the project. That's the way we took each of the sites through this. And as you can see up top is, identifying what's your why. It's really small here, but we asked you to identify, and this is, again, is what each of the sites did, identifying your why and identifying stakeholders. So literally all the things that Andy talked about is the process that's used here. So there's phase one is in the planning phase. Phase two, next slide, JL, is how to engage a equity work group. Andy talked about that a little. Here you'll see more information around like who you bring to the table and how to determine. I mean, there's some worksheets on identifying who's a decision maker, who's a stakeholder, who's a influencer, who's a dot connector. That's there. There's a piece which was really critical to the work is defining workforce equity for your region, because what it looks like in Dallas will be different from what it looks like in Seattle. And so that's a critical piece of the work. And what we found is that each time, as the groups went through this was also useful in just bringing the groups together and level setting about how they move forward with the work. So next slide, phase three, is the data exploration. So one of the reasons why we did the 3 data series is because it's really hard to talk about the data process in a guide in a way that can really, hold attention, because it's a lot of information. So when this rolls out, the webinar series that we did here with the National Equity Atlas and how we went through that data, how we do factor analysis, and then how we get to strategies, the webinar series will live here as part of the data exploration. But we do provide data resources and talk to you and share how we went through that process as well too. Phase 4, Joe, and then building the strategy, which is, again, you heard Andy talk about that, and there are things for you to consider as you move through this phase. And then the final phase is turning your strategy into action and things that you consider there. So anyways, and so we have resources attached to that. And this is one part of it, of the guide, but what will happen probably towards the end of the fall is that we will add a piece on about systems change, right? Like what kind of systems change work are looking at systems change and how to do systems change or identify like problem identification in systems and how we think about that at the National Fund. That will be a lead into this at some point. So we are building this toolkit all the way out, but the guide is what will debut first, end of May. So I will pause here. We are at time. If there are any questions, I will hang on for a couple seconds. If not, thank you all for attending this 3 webinar series. We appreciate you deep. And if you don't have any questions now, but you may in the future, feel free to reach out and we are happy to chat with you. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Alexandria. Thanks, Andy. You're always a rock star.
Oh, thank you. So I'll see you on Friday. I'm going to hop on to my next meeting.
Okay, bye.
All right, bye.